Welcome to this Wise Owl tutorial on variables and simple arrays in Power Automate. Here's what you'll learn during the tutorial. We'll begin by looking at what this tutorial will cover and the next two as well. This is the first of a three-part series. It's counting how many files are in a OneDrive folder and also in a SharePoint folder and then comparing the two. We'll then look at the variables you need to create to make everything work, and then we'll concentrate on the OneDrive side of things, looking at initializing the variables we need for OneDrive, getting the array of files from the folder, collapsing this array, I'll explain what that means, and then counting how many files are in the remaining collapsed array. And finally, I'll show you in summary how to do exactly the same thing for SharePoint. But that's enough of me speaking, I think. I'm going to hand control over again to my alter ego, and let's get started. So this tutorial is the first of a series of three, and I really would recommend that you stay with the series because it's going to teach you so much about all the different useful parts of Power Automate. In this first part, what we're going to do is compare the number of files in a OneDrive folder and the number of files in a SharePoint folder. So you can see there's 2 recipe files in OneDrive and there's 3 in SharePoint. And all we're going to do is say that if the number isn't equal, we'll send an email looking something like this, saying that the number of recipes in each folder isn't equal and giving how many recipes we found in each. There's probably much better ways to do this, by the way, but this is the way which teaches you best about Power Automate. So I've got here 3 flows showing what the 3 different tutorials coming up will show. The first one will just use variables in a second to count the number of recipes. So you can see it's fairly linear. And the end result of that will just be a compose statement listing out how many recipes we found in each folder without any test of any condition. So that's the first one. The second tutorial will tidy this up. So this is exactly the same flow, but you can see it's much tidier. There's 2 main changes. One is that we've introduced something called a parallel path. So you can see the flow can go down one path on the left, or it can go down one path on the right. And the second thing is we've got something called a scope. So we've condensed all the things to do with OneDrive into one scope and all the things to do with SharePoint in another scope, and it makes the whole thing much easier to read. And you'll also learn in the second part of the tutorial about how to make expressions easier to read and various other things to do with expression editing. The final third tutorial will show how to write conditions. So you can see at the bottom there's a condition here, and what that will do is show how you can test whether one number is equal to the other or not and react accordingly. So taken the 3 tutorials together should finally end up sending this email if the number of files isn't equal in the 2 folders. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get started on the first of the 3 tutorials, and in particular, let's look at variables. So we're going to create 6 variables to make this example work, 3 to do with OneDrive, 3 to do with SharePoint. The first variable we'll create is going to be called OneDrive folder path, and it will store the name of the folder containing the OneDrive files. So you can see from this that a variable is just a space inside the computer's memory, which can hold a bit of information. The second variable will be called OneDrive files, and that will hold a list of all the files. There's only 2 in the OneDrive folder. That's called an array. And the third variable will hold the number of files we found, OneDrive file count, and that will hold the number 2 after the flow is finished running. And then there'll be an equivalent thing for SharePoint. So there'll be a variable to hold the SharePoint folder path, which will be slightly more complicated. There'll be a variable to hold the list of files, which is going to be considerably more complicated because we'll hold a lot more information about them. And then there'll be a third variable to hold the number of files we found, which will hold the number 3 when we finish running the flow. So those are the variables we'll need. I think a bit of theory on variables is needed, and this won't take more than a minute or so. There's 6 types of variable in Power Automate. Boolean variables hold yes or no values. Integers hold whole numbers. So we'll use an integer variable to hold the number of files found in each folder. Floating point variables hold any other number apart from integers. We won't be needing them. String variables, we'll use those to hold the file paths. That's just any bits of text. I'm not going to bother with object variables for the moment. We'll come to that in a later tutorial in this series. And an array variable holds a list of things. So a set of different bits of text or a set of different numbers. And in this case, we'll use two array variables to hold the list of files in each of the two folders. What can you do with variables? You can do 6 things to them. And typically, they're presented in alphabetical order, which isn't perhaps the most useful way. So what I've done is reordered them, and this is what you can do with a variable. The first thing you have to do with a variable is to initialize it. You can't do anything until you've initialized a variable. Thereafter, you can change the value of it by using the set variable action. You can add or decrease values by using increment or decrement variable. You can append to it if it's a string variable by adding something onto the end of it. And if it's an array, you can add something onto the end of the array. And that's all you can do. Now, for most people, this may be okay. If you're an experienced programmer, you'll find it slightly, unexpected that these are all the things you can do. And in particular, if you want to do a command like x equals x plus 1, then you have to use the increment variable action, which is possibly not what you'd be expecting. So in order to start this process, I need to create a new flow. So I'll do just that. It'll be an instant cloud flow because I want to run it at the touch of a button, as it were. I'll call my flow compare OneDrive and SharePoint files. I'll manually trigger it and click on the create button. So the next thing it needs to do is to set some variables. I'm just going to do the OneDrive variables for the moment because it's a bit tedious creating 6 variables, and you'll get the idea for OneDrive. So I click on New Step, and I'm going to search within the variable commands or actions. And what I need to do is initialize a variable. Don't forget, I can't choose set variable until I've initialized it. So I'll choose initialize variable. I'll type in the name of my first variable, which is OneDrive folder path. And then I need to choose what type it is. It's a string. It's going to hold a string of text. And naturally, it's going to hold the string of text OneDrive recipes. There's no need for any quotation marks around that. In fact, you can't use it. What it would be a good idea now is to rename this task and call it something more sensible. So I'm just going to put set folder path or something like that. But if I had more time and you weren't watching, I'd probably give it a more sensible name. So now I'll create my second variable. And for this, I'll just type in initialize and choose initialize variable. My variable name this time is OneDrive files. And this is going to contain a list of all the files I found. So it's an array. Wherever you have a collection of things, not just a single item, you choose an array as a variable type. I don't want to put an initial value, so I'm going to put two square brackets, one after the other. And what that does is sets it to be an empty array. And then for my third variable, I'm going to again choose initialize variable. And my third variable is going to be called OneDrive file count. And I'll set that to be, in this case, an integer because you have to have a whole number of files. And I'll set it to 0. I'll reset it later to a more sensible number during my flow. And I guess to be a good Power Automate flow builder, I should also rename these. So set array of OneDrive files might be a good name for that. And for my third and final one, it should probably be something like set file count OneDrive. But again, I leave it to you to choose more sensible names. So those are my 3 initialized variables. Now that I've set my variables, what I want to do is to create, or rather to set the value of the OneDrive files array to equal the contents of the folder. So if all goes well, the OneDrive files array will contain these 2 items, amaretto cheesecake and lasagna. To do this, I can create a new step. And because I'm getting files from OneDrive, I can search for the OneDrive actions, and I can choose, you would think, list files in folder. This is the obvious thing to choose, but it won't work. And the reason it won't work is because of what it's asking for. It's saying, give me a unique identifier of a folder, but we don't have that. All we have is a variable containing the folder path. We've done it like that so that we'll be able to change the folder path in future if we choose to store our recipes in a different place, and this flow will still work. but we haven't actually got the ID of the folder, and that's what we need. So we're going to have to delete this action for the moment and do this in 2 stages. The stages will be: number 1, use the folder path to get an ID for the folder itself, and part 2, list the files in the folder with that ID. And this process of doing 2 stages, 1 to get the ID of something and 2 to get more information about it, runs throughout the whole of Power Automate. So the first step, if I click on New Step, will be to choose a OneDrive action. And what I want to do is to get the file metadata using the path. That's not the world's easiest thing to guess or to find, but you can see it's going to be one of the ones which allows me to use the path to get some information. And I don't particularly want the file content, so by elimination, I could choose Get File Metadata using path. I could then type in, you might think, the name of the variable, but if I do that, it won't work again, because what that will do is assume the folder is actually called OneDrive folder path, and it's not. It's called OneDrive recipes. What I've typed in is a variable name, and I want the variable contents. So instead of that, what I can do is click on the variable name in the dynamic content list, and it will put that in for me. And if I let my mouse linger over that, you can see it's putting the value of the variable called OneDrive folder path. I can then add the second step of my 2-step series, and what this will do is get the list of the files in that folder. So this time I can choose List Files in Folder. I can choose my identifier for that as the value unique identifier returned from the previous task or previous action, and that will give me the folder. And hopefully when I run this now, you'll see that that action should return a list of the files in the folder. So let's see if that actually does happen. So if I now click on that last action and see the outputs from it, look at the raw outputs, you can see after the header information, it's containing the 2 files. The first file is this one here, with all sorts of information about it, and the second file is that one there. So far, so good. So I left you on a cliffhanger at the end of the previous session. We were looking at the output from running the program, running the flow, listing the files in the folder, and looking at the raw outputs. What I want to do is set my array called OneDrive files, not to hold all of this rubbish. I'm not interested in all of this information, but just to hold the bit I want. So the bit I want is the name of the file. So I want to create an array which holds amaretto cheesecake and lasagna. And this is probably the hardest bit of this tutorial. What you need to do, and this won't be the last time I invite you to do this, is to have a look at the JSON file. In general, in JSON, you can disregard all the header information. So all this is just telling you something about the HTML page being returned. You can forget about it. And just concentrate solely on the body section. So the body section contains the bits of information that you can get at. In this case, the bit of information you can get at, there's only really one, which is a value. So what we're going to do is get at the value, and within the value, we're going to get at the name property. So if you could remember those 2 words, please, value and name. So to do this, I just need to come out of this and go into editing it. I need to add a step. I can't use set variable to set this array. So I can't just choose set variable because I'm doing something more complicated. I'm collapsing the array at the same time, so I just get a single value from it. So instead of that, what I'm going to do is add a step using a select action. Could I but spell? And the select action will take from something. The something it will take it from is going to be listed down here. It's the output from the previous step. You can see if I go down far enough, it looks like there's nothing there, but there is. You can see down there the value. This is Power Automate. It says blob metadata collection. I don't know if that means a lot to you, but it doesn't mean a great deal to me. So you have to look at the JSON file to work out which property you want to return. That's the only way you can tell that, as far as I can see. I want from that the key. Now, take it from me, you need to click on that little icon to switch to just showing a single field. And then you can pick up from that the name of the file or folder. So what that will do, I hope, when we run this, let's see if it works, is to return just the names of the files. So if I now look at the output from that after running it, you can see that it shows me my outputs. That's what I wanted to capture. That's really good. It's got the 2 bits of information I needed. So what I can now do is go back into editing it, and I can add in another step. And what this can do is set a value of my array variable. Coming up, so I'll have to do it from this. Set in a value of my array variable. The variable I want to choose here is the one called OneDrive files, and I want to set it to the value returned from the previous step, which is the output from the previous step. So I've now got an array which gives me the files. And what I can now do is count how many there are in that, how many items there are in that array. So what I'm now going to do is count the number of files in the variable called OneDrive file count. So I can add a new step, and I can choose a variable action. And what I want to do is set the value of a variable. The variable is the one called OneDrive file count, and I want to set that to be the number of items in the array, which is 2. I know that, but I can't just type in 2 because it may change. To do this, I need to create an expression. I'll be spending much time in this course showing you how to find expression functions, but for the moment I'm going to cheat and actually tell you. The function you want is length. And if you type in an open brackets, it's now expecting a collection or an array so that it can determine how many elements there are in it. The array is held in a variable called OneDrive files. So I need to type in the word variables. I can just type in part of it and then press the tab key to auto-complete it. Then type in an open round brackets. And then in single inverted commas, I can type in the name of my variable. But there's absolutely nothing helping me here. So it's up to me to use the right case and the right letters to make sure that works okay. Otherwise, when I run my program, I'm going to get a bug. So I can then choose OK, and it builds up an expression, which I can see when I hover over it. So now I could just quickly summarize this. I'm going to add a cheeky little compose action, just to show the results of this. And I'll just say OneDrive files, and then a colon, and then I'll put in the value of that variable just to see if this is working. So if I save that, and then what I'm going to do is test this out. You'll notice I keep testing after every 1 or 2 actions, otherwise there's no way of knowing whether you're on the right track. And when I run that and look at the results of this, you can see the output of that is 2. So it's taken me all this point to count that there's 2 files in that folder. And now all I need to do is the same thing for SharePoint. So the final thing I'm going to do with this flow is just take you through the changes I made to introduce SharePoint 2. So we've got the list of files in the OneDrive folder. We now want to get the list of files in the SharePoint recipes folder. If you notice, the SharePoint recipe folders has this path. Can you see it says shared documents up there? I'll just highlight that. That's actually shared space documents. And the folder itself is called SharePoint recipes. This took quite some time to work out what you should actually type in, but here goes. So when I'm setting my variable referring to my SharePoint recipe folder, you need to type in / shared space documents / and then the name of the folder. Nothing else seems to work. It's very, very precise. It took me a long time to work this out. Then I can create a variable to hold the number of recipes found, which will be 0 to begin with, just like I did for OneDrive. And I can also set an array to hold a list of all the SharePoint files, which is an array which I'll also set to an empty array, just like I did for OneDrive. What we'll then do further down is to get the SharePoint folder, get the ID of it, and then list out the files in this folder. Now to do this, when you have an action like this, you can let your mouse linger over the question mark and click on it to come up with help on it. And one of the most useful things it tells you is what the original action was called, because otherwise there's a danger you seem to have lost this information. So the action you need to search for is to get the folder metadata using the path. And then you can choose your site address and fill in the variable containing your folder path. Likewise, for the next action, I've renamed it, but the original action was called list folder. And what I'm doing with this is to get the files in the folder. So the combination of those two actions will give me a list of the files. And I think at this point, it's probably a good idea to run that up to that stage so you can see what's actually coming out of that. So if I run this flow and look at the output from my get files in this SharePoint folder, you can see the outputs. So just like we had for OneDrive, you can see you've got the header information and then some information on each file. So that's the first file called Veggie Chili. That's the second one called Amaretto Cheesecake. And that's the third one called Lasagna. And I could do what I did before and collapse this, but there was actually no need. I'll choose a simpler version which captures all of the information in the array, just to keep things simple. So what I've done on the next line is to set a variable called SharePoint files to be the entire body returned from that task. So my array will contain multiple bits of information, but then I can still use the length function to get the length of that array. So I didn't need to use the select action I chose for the OneDrive files. I did it just because I wanted to show you collapsing an array. And finally, on my compose action, I've added an extra line to give the number of SharePoint recipe files found. And what I could now do is to run this one more time. With a bit of luck, when I look at the output from the compose task right at the bottom, which is just about to run, I hope, it's busy counting the number of SharePoint files, then you can see that I have 2 OneDrive files, 3 SharePoint files. What I'll do in the next tutorial in this series is tidy up this flow. And then in the third and final tutorial in the series, we'll look at writing in a condition to test which of the 2 numbers is greater and send an email if they're not equal.